Before we begin the story of the rabbit who refused to eat alone, a heartbreaking tale of love, loss, and silent bonds, I invite you to get comfortable. Let the world fade for a while. If you find yourself drawn into these quiet tales, feel free to like and subscribe. It helps more stories find their way to the firelight. Now, let's begin. It began in a farmhouse that never locked its doors, where the floorboards whispered with the weight of long-settled dust and the windows sighed in the wind like old lungs. Not a strange house, exactly, but there were stories that clung to it like ivy. Quiet ones. The kind people only tell when the sun goes down. The neighbors spoke of a rabbit. Not just any rabbit, they'd say, lowering their voices slightly, like the words belonged to someone else. A rabbit soft as fog, with fur the color of early snow and eyes that never blinked too long. You'd catch her watching you through the slats of her hutch and wonder if you'd imagined the weight of that gaze. But she was always watching. And she would not eat. Not unless someone was there. Not unless someone was watching her back. It made no sense. Animals, like children, eat when they're hungry, don't they? Yet this one, they said, would sit beside her food untouched for hours. Then, as if sensing the shift of eyes settling on her, she'd begin to nibble. Not greedily, not urgently, just enough. Slowly, carefully. Like each bite needed permission. The first time someone noticed it, it was passed off as coincidence. The third time, they called it curious. By the 10th, they began to wonder. Some said it was grief, picked up from its owner, a quiet girl with two wide eyes and silence stitched between her sentences. Others whispered words like haunting, or instinct, or bond. But no one could explain the way the rabbit paused, mid-motion, ears tilted, not toward sound, but toward silence itself. A kind of listening that lives only in creatures who have once forgotten how to be seen. They named her Thistle. No one recalls exactly who gave her the name, only that once it was spoken, it fit too perfectly to question. Sharp and soft at once. Wild and rooted. She didn't speak, of course. But she had her rules. And the first one was this: she would not eat unless she felt eyes on her. Not just any eyes. Not just any person. It had to be someone who noticed her. Someone who meant it. It was such a small detail. A rabbit with a preference. A quirk. But sometimes, the smallest things ask the biggest questions. Why would a creature, born into instinct, hunger, and the twitch of flight, linger beside food untouched, simply waiting? What does it mean to eat only when witnessed? What did she know about being alone? What had she once lost? This is not a ghost story. But something moved in that house. In the hush beneath supper tables and along the hem of sunset. Something mournful. Something quietly alive. And always, always, there was the rabbit, her eyes like dark glass, waiting for someone to see her. Not just look. See. It's where the story begins. With a glance. And the rabbit who waited for it. It rained the morning she came home. Not a thunderstorm, not a downpour, just that soft kind of rain that feels like a secret, like something the earth says only to itself. The sky was the color of washed denim, and the road back from town slicked under the tires with a sound like paper tearing. Lila sat in the passenger seat, fingers pressed against a cardboard box on her lap, holding it steady as if a wrong turn might break something open. She hadn't said much since they left the shelter. Her father glanced sideways once or twice but didn't ask. Grief had settled over their house months ago, and the silence between them was no longer uncomfortable, it was expected. Instead, he drove quietly, the way one might drive a hearse. And in Lila's lap, the box shifted once. Then again. Inside, something small sighed. When they arrived, she took the box upstairs without a word. The walls of her room still wore the posters she'd hung as a child, stars, whales, a crooked painting her Nana had made. She'd imagined bringing the rabbit home would make the space feel warmer. Instead, the air hung heavier. A kind of waiting. She opened the box. And out came the eyes. Large, dark, unblinking, like something nocturnal. The rabbit didn't flinch at the sudden light or hop into her hands. She merely sat there, still as a breath, ears tilted slightly. Watching. Her fur was not quite gray, not quite white. More like fog catching moonlight. I think I'll call you Thistle, Lila said, softly, as if noise might startle her back into the box. The rabbit didn't move. 12 hours passed without food. Lila placed fresh hay beside her, scattered soft pellets, even offered her pieces of carrot like bribes. Thistle remained where she was, perfect posture, eyes on the door. When Lila left the room, she pressed an ear to the hallway and listened, but heard nothing. Not a nibble, not a shuffle, only that brutal stillness. The second day, Lila sat down on the floor beside the cage, cross-legged, her knees aching against the hardwood. "You have to eat," she whispered. "Please." She rested her head against the cage bars, letting her hand drift close, but not too close. A few minutes passed. The rain had stopped. Somewhere downstairs, her father moved a chair. Then, movement. It wasn't dramatic, nor sudden. Thistle leaned forward slowly, as if testing the weight of each motion. Her nose brushed the hay. Paused. Then, a blink. And the bite. Small, neat, almost ceremonial. Lila didn't move. She only stared. Barely breathed. As if stopping to watch too closely might shatter the moment. Thistle chewed, eyes never leaving hers, as though the act of eating was less about hunger and more about being seen. Lila sat there until dusk bruised the windows. When she went downstairs and told her father, he frowned. She must have just been settling in. Animals get stressed. But it wasn't just stress, Lila knew it. Because the next morning, when she came in singing softly to herself, Thistle was already at the edge of her cage, food untouched. She sat upright, alert. And waited. The moment Lila sat, she began again. That afternoon, Lila left a recorder on the dusted bookshelf and sat away from the room, watching through a narrow hallway crack like a spy. Thistle ignored the food entirely. Not a sniff. Not even a glance. But when Lila, unable to stop herself, leaned close enough to cast a shadow across the cage, the reaction was instant. A twitch of the ear. A glance. Then, quiet, rhythmic chewing. And so it began. A pattern born not of training, but of some invisible thread, one Lila hadn't tied, just noticed. She tried, once, to test it. Asked her father to walk into the room and talk kindly toward the rabbit. Thistle didn't move. He offered food, bright orange in color. Nothing. Lila stepped in behind him, and with a deep breath, said her name again. Thistle turned her head. And ate. "She only eats for you," her father said, trying to laugh. But Lila didn't. Because in her bones, she recognized the sensation. That quiet, aching wait for someone to see you, really see you. Thistle didn't want a meal. She wanted presence. She wanted permission. She wanted an answer to a question no one had said aloud. So every morning after that, Lila made it a ritual. She'd bring in the food, sit by the cage, whisper soft words that didn't have to mean anything. And Thistle, in return, would eat like something delicate, like each bite was a promise not to disappear. There were rules, not written down, not spoken, but there, just the same, as real as the smell of hay and as steady as the morning light that poured through the window each dawn. Thistle would not eat unless someone was in the room. Not just near, present. It had to be a kind of still presence, the sort that hovered gently in the air like dust waiting to settle. If you bustled through, she stayed still. If you sat and breathed with her, she'd eat. But not before. And there were other rules, too. She hated the sound of doors closing. Not loudly, even a soft click made her ears twitch, and she'd retreat to the farthest edge of her cage until the latch softened into silence again. So Lila stopped closing doors altogether. Her room remained cracked open like a breath held in the middle of saying something important. Every evening, just before sunset, Thistle moved to the same corner of the room. A quiet little ritual, no rush in her steps, just a slow turn of her body, ending with her nose pointed toward the west-facing window. She wouldn't do much there. Just sit, still, watchful, as if waiting for something to return. It became easy to believe she knew something the rest of them didn't. Lila once counted. Thistle's paws always touched the exact edge of the rug fringe. To the thread. One evening, weeks after Thistle arrived, Lila tried to coax her with her favorite dried apple. But when the door clicked shut, softly, mindfully, Thistle froze. Not afraid, just stilled, like a person holding their breath until they remembered they didn't have to. The window caught the last shard of gold, and in that tiny hush, the rabbit turned her head, not to the door, but to the sill, to a patch of empty light. No movement, no explanation, just the stillness of something seen and familiar. She's just odd. Lila had laughed once to her dad, trying to make it small, trying to make it normal. But the rules hardened with time. New ones growing beneath the first. When Lila's mother first fell ill, the kind of illness that deepens like a shadow at dusk, everything changed again. Her house shrank, the lights dimmed, meals turned into obligations, and Thistle. She stopped eating, not entirely, but enough that Lila noticed. She tried staying in the room longer, crooning, reading aloud, but the rabbit remained beside her hay, unmoving, gaze slipping now and then toward the chair Lila would sit in. Waiting. On the fourth day, after a long night with no answers downstairs, Lila did something different. She took her blanket, folded it over her lap, and sank into the old armchair in the corner of the room, brittle springs and all. She didn't speak. She didn't move, just breathed, softly, eyes toward the shadows dancing on the walls. And Thistle, as if pulled by something gentler than hope, stepped forward. She leaned into her food, slow and deliberate, ate a few silent bites, then looked to the chair. Satisfied, she returned to her nest of bedding at the back of the cage. Lila realized it then. It wasn't just about being seen. It was about proximity, about presence. There were rules hidden in silence, written in gestures. Meet her gaze. Breathe near. Don't close the door. Wait for the sun to brush the corner windowsill. Be someone solid in the quiet. That was the language Thistle spoke. Not affection, not obedience, but participation. Shared time, not just shared space. It somehow made Lila's own grief easier to carry, knowing someone else had their own way of coping, their own rituals of loneliness. And these silent, careful rules, however strange, wove them closer than any words might have. Lila sometimes wondered if, in some other life, Thistle had been alone for far too long enough to forget how to ask for company, and instead, set little fires of routine to lead someone back to her. Either way, Lila followed. She always followed. It was never sudden, the way they came to depend on each other. It happened in pieces, like the soft folding of fabric, one layer atop another. A quiet routine that wrapped around them before either of them realized they'd begun to rely on it. Lila started spending more evenings in the room. Sometimes she brought schoolwork, pages rustling in her lap. Other times, she just sat with her legs tucked beneath her, the chair creaking under her weight as night pressed itself against the window panes. And Thistle was always there. Not in her lap, never that kind of closeness, but close enough. Sometimes curled by the bars, sometimes stretched out beneath the window's thinning light. A presence at once constant and fragile, like a string tied between them. When Lila cried, those silent, collapsing kinds of tears that didn't need an audience, Thistle would shift. One ear would tilt. Her body would rotate, just enough to let her face Lila. She never came closer. She just looked, as if to say, I notice. And somehow, it helped. When Lila studied for exams, Thistle watched in stillness, her breath slow and visible when the nights turned cold. When storms rolled in, rattling windows and snapping trees, Thistle thumped just once. Not in fear, but as a signal. And Lila would murmur, I know. Me too. They shared things without naming them. And always, meals were shared in silence. Thistle would not eat if another person sat in. Lila tried, once, to let her brother sit nearby while she ran to the kitchen. But Thistle refused the food, nose hovering while her body remained still. Only when Lila returned, cheeks flushed from rushing back, did the rabbit lean forward and begin again. Her father said, she acts like you're her whole world. Lila just nodded, because it felt mutual. There was a particular day, brilliantly ordinary, when her grandmother sat on the porch shelling peas and watching the rain. Lila stood beside her, Thistle tucked gently in her arms, a white tuft against her chest. Nana looked over, eyes warm. She doesn't eat unless you're with her, Lila said. Nana didn't look surprised. Some creatures, she said slowly, forget how to eat when they're alone. She said it like it wasn't strange. Like it was a truth passed down, the way people pull quilts from old trunks. And Lila felt seen in a way she didn't expect. Not just as a girl with a strange rabbit, but as someone who understood the ache in silence. That night, as stories from the porch drifted upstairs, Lila stayed beside Thistle's hutch longer than usual. Not because she had to, but because it felt like a kind of prayer. You're not alone, she whispered, fingers curled gently near the cage. You don't have to be. Thistle leaned her head slightly, eyes meeting hers. It was a small thing. But small things make up most of what's important. Later that week, Lila couldn't sleep. The weight of everything rose and fell in her chest like low tide. She curled beneath her blanket, staring at the ceiling, the kind of staring that feels more like thinking with your eyes than looking. And then, a sound. Not loud, just the quiet crunching of hay from the far corner of the room. Steady, calm. Thistle was eating. Lila hadn't realized how still the room had been until that small noise reminded her it could hold life. Her throat closed, not from sadness, but something older. Gratitude, maybe, or the deep comfort of being needed. She closed her eyes, listening to the slow rhythm of chewing. And for a brief moment, the grief no longer felt like drowning. Just water. Just something that could carry you. It was the 5th evening since Elsie disappeared when Thistle left her dish untouched. Lila hadn't been home when the news broke, just a text from her classmate, a half sentence about police cars and missing posters. At first, she didn't believe it. Not Elsie, who walked home the same way every day, humming songs and kicking gravel with her worn boots. Not Elsie, who once climbed the willow tree with a paperback tucked into her back pocket. But she wasn't in her bed that night. Wasn't on the path through the trees. And by morning, the world had gone quieter somehow, like the air itself had tightened. Thistle didn't eat. She didn't even pretend to check her food. Just sat beside the door, ears up, body still and stiff like frost on a leaf. Lila whispered to her, the same gentle words she always used. Sat beside her. Stayed until the house dimmed and shadows climbed the walls. But Thistle didn't move. Her gaze stayed fixed on the door, as though it might open to reveal something they'd both forgotten they were waiting for. The next day brought search dogs and volunteers with flannel jackets and gripping flashlights. The woods were louder than ever, filled with shouted names and the snap of branches. Lila watched from her bedroom window. A silent observer. Her eyes flicked between tree lines and the gray sky, hoping to make sense of the nothingness that had ballooned between everyone. Thistle still didn't eat. On the third night, she pressed herself up against the baseboard as close to the door as she could get, and wouldn't budge. Lila left the food nearby. Clean water. Her grandmother's apple treats. None of it touched. Lila touched her gently once, just behind the ears. Thistle didn't flinch, but didn't react either. She was waiting, not in the usual way. This wasn't for presents. This wasn't about being seen. This was something else. By the fourth day, the whispers around town had thickened. Fear mixed itself into coffee cups and grocery lines. People stopped making eye contact. Everything began to feel like the moment before a storm but without clouds. That night, as the world slipped into shadow, Thistle thumped twice. Not loud, just two firm taps against the floorboards. Then she resumed her post, back curled slightly, nose aimed to the southwest corner of the room. Lila sat straight up in bed. She didn't know why it shook her. Thistle thumped sometimes, but not like that. Not without reason, not with certainty. It echoed in her like a bell rung once, then again. Later, when she came down to the kitchen, her father looked up from his coffee. "They're sending out another search group," he said, tapping at a folded map. This time, deeper into the pines. By the sugar maple, Lila murmured, without thinking. He looked up. "How do you know?" She didn't know how she knew. Only that Thistle had looked that way. That evening, they bundled thermoses and headlamps and hiked further than they had in days. The air was bitter, but something about the steady rhythm of boots in leaves, the hush of shared silence, gave Lila direction. And just as the last light began to sink, beneath the sugar maple, nestled beneath wet brush and blankets torn from branches, was Elsie. Cold, shivering, barely conscious, but alive. Her lips moved when they found her. She said one word, "Eyes." Lila didn't sleep that night. She sat beside Thistle instead, close enough that her toes curled around her slippers and her elbows rested on her knees. She didn't say thank you. She didn't have to. Thistle turned from the door at last and stepped toward her food, taking one bite, then another. Not like reward, like return. It began with socks, folded neatly in a drawer that would never be opened again. The kind her Nana had knit, with little mismatched stripes and one heel stitched in purple thread. Lila pulled them out one morning before school, not realizing what she was looking for until the scent caught her, wool and apple soap, and stopped her breath. The grief had been quiet since Elsie came back. Sharp, of course, but quiet, like a blade tucked under fabric. And now it returned with full weight, as if it had only stepped outside to catch its breath. Lila didn't go to school that day. Her father didn't ask why. Downstairs, everyone was whispering, saying things like, "She passed peacefully," and "At least she didn't suffer." But none of that touched the empty place in Lila's chest where her Nana's voice used to be. The place where bedtime stories had lingered like fingerprints against a lamp. All day, the house felt like a listening thing. Every creaking floorboard, every hinge, it all wanted something from her. Some response, some emotion, but Lila gave it nothing. She crawled under her blankets, turned her face toward the wall, and waited for it to stop aching. Thistle didn't eat that day. Lila barely noticed, tucked too far into herself to remember the rituals. The hay sat where it always did. The dish gleamed faintly beneath the window, untouched. Across the room, the rabbit sat still. It could have gone unnoticed. Probably should have. But on the second morning, Lila woke to something unusual. Sound. A light scratch. Then a second. Careful, deliberate. She sat up slowly, her limbs heavy, and saw the smallest thing. Thistle had nudged her food dish closer. Not toward herself, but toward the bed. She was sitting beside it. Quiet, alert. Waiting in that careful way she always had, only now not for someone to see her. She was watching Lila. The message lived in the act itself. Simple, wordless. It said, "You haven't eaten either." Lila swallowed. Her throat still ached. Her arms felt wrong. But she reached out and pulled the edge of the blanket back, just enough to see past her knees. And there was Thistle. No drama, no desperation, just presence. Between them, ritual shifted. Lila climbed out of bed, walked to the hall, and brought back a slice of bread with jam. She ate it sitting against her mattress, back bent, hands shaking. And only then did Thistle lean forward and eat. It didn't take much. Just a bite. A signal. That night, Lila left the door wide open. She lit her Nana's old lamp and let the light spill across the carpet. Folded the socks carefully and placed them by the cage. Put one apple slice beside the food dish. She sat until the house exhaled, until even the memories fell quiet. Thistle thumped once, then curled beside her bedding. Lila whispered, "Thank you." The next few days passed like ashes. Soft, weightless things that clung to the lungs. The funeral came and went like a fogged window, clusters of people pressing their fingers against the glass but never quite breaking through. Thistle stayed close. Everyone brought food that week. Casseroles in glass dishes, pies with names carved into their crusts. People said things like, "She lived a good life," and "It's the quiet ones who leave the biggest echoes." But Lila only smiled when polite, spoke when asked, and each evening she sat in her room with the rabbit who needed her near. Not everyone felt the change in the house. But Lila did. She felt it in the silence between floorboards. In the way her father paused by her door at night, not knocking, just lingering. In the way the drawers remained closed. In how none of that stopped the world from continuing. Still, Thistle waited. Not for food. For stillness. They shared it now, this necessity. Each bite was permission. A soft mutual nod that said, "We're still here." One evening, Lila reached into the cabinet where her grandmother had kept yarn and found a scrap forgotten beneath a tin. Pale lilac. The exact shade Nana used for Thistle's blanket. Lila wound it gently between her fingers. Then, without thinking, whispered, "She used to save apple slices for you." The rabbit perked one ear, like a yes. And for the first time in days, Lila smiled. Thin as a thread, but present. They ate together that night, side by side. And for one quiet moment, the house felt less empty. The night before she left, Lila sat cross-legged on the floor, brushing out the soft tangles in Thistle's fur with slow fingers. The suitcase stood by the door, a silent suggestion of mourning. College. Change. Distance. Thistle didn't seem nervous. She never did. But when Lila lifted her hand to stroke between the rabbit's ears, the little body leaned into her palm just slightly, barely enough to notice, but enough. "I wish I could take you," Lila whispered. "But they don't allow." She stopped. She wasn't sure what she was going to say. Rabbits. Grief. Gentle things. Instead, she leaned down until her forehead touched the floor beside the rabbit's cage. "I'll call you. Every day." Thistle blinked slowly, listened to the soft breath between syllables. In the morning, Lila's father drove her to the station. 2 hours, luggage shifting in the back. Neither of them said much. There was too much beneath the silence to make room for words. When Lila boarded the train, she only turned around once. The house, on its own, felt stranger than it ever had. Not in sound. In absence. Thistle waited by the door after they returned. She skipped her breakfast hay. Sat beneath the chair where Lila used to study. Would not move. Lila's father tried everything. He played soft classical music. Offered fresh carrot slices cut in the same tiny curl Lila used to make. He even searched the internet for "rabbit won't eat after owner leaves," then gave up halfway through dumping warm towels in the corner. No use. Finally, Lila called. A short FaceTime. Just to check in. Her father answered, casting the camera around the room awkwardly. "She's not eating," he said, voice low, like it might make things worse. "Put me near her," Lila said. So he did. Set the phone against a stack of books, the camera angled slightly down. Not perfect, but enough. Lila leaned in close to the screen, whispering, "Hey there." "Hey, Thistle. It's me." For a moment, nothing. Then, without fanfare or hesitation, Thistle moved. A simple step forward. Her nose dipped down, and she began to eat. A slow rhythm. Calm. Lila didn't realize she was crying until her father stepped back and said, "Well, how about that?" They started doing it every day. 10 minutes before her first class. 30 on weekends. Lila would sit in her dorm room with her laptop, hardly speaking, just existing in the same strange, distant bubble of time. And Thistle would eat. Nothing fancy. Just enough. Just right. When Lila made new friends and they asked about her morning routines, she'd smile and say, "My rabbit needs company to eat." They laughed. Thought it cute. Eccentric. But Lila knew better. It wasn't habit. It wasn't some trained trick. It was proximity, paused and translated through light and screen and careful voice. It was a gaze that still mattered, even across miles. On a late October morning, when Lila overslept through her alarm and missed their scheduled call, she panicked. Heartsick and fumbling, she called her father, breath already tight. "I forgot. Is she okay?" He sounded groggy, then reassured her. She waited by the screen. Wouldn't touch her food. I turned it on for her. Played an old recording of you reading that night after your nana passed. Lila covered her mouth with her hand. She ate during that. Felt the difference when it ended. That week, Lila recorded new videos. Little messages. Soft readings. A few minutes of her sitting in the common room, glancing toward the camera and whispering the rabbit's name. When she came back home for winter break, Thistle perked up the moment Lila's voice echoed in the hallway. Scuttled to the edge of the door. Nose twitching against the familiar. That night at dinner, Thistle ate with a joy Lila hadn't seen in months. Not like routine, like reunion. They didn't speak about it much, Lila and her father. But now and again, he'd smile across the living room and say, "That rabbit of yours would have followed you to the moon." To which Lila would respond, "I'd have brought her in my pocket if the university let me." No one else understood. And that was fine. Some kinds of love don't ask to be explained. They just ask to be shared, gently. Again and again. From wherever you are. The new rabbit was nothing like Thistle. He arrived on a Tuesday in June, all wobbly limbs and excess energy, a rescued flurry of cinnamon brown fur and wide, uncertain eyes. Lila had named him Pip before the carrier door even opened, after a character in her favorite childhood book, small, hopeful, a little lost. Thistle did not approve. When Lila placed Pip gently in the far corner of the room, his own bedding, his own food, Thistle didn't even look at him. Just turned her body away with the precise, regal indifference of someone pointing to a closed door without speaking. Pip, for his part, was delighted. He skittered forward, eager to explore this strange fur-like fog creature who smelled faintly of apples and old air. She didn't bite. She didn't sniff. She simply blinked, slow and final, and stepped back. "I thought you'd like a friend," Lila said, sitting in the space between them. But Thistle had never needed frenetic movement. She had made peace with shadows. Pip, bless his brave little heart, was still trying to outrun them. For days she kept her distance. No matter how Pip bounced or chirped or burrowed. She'd wait until Lila sat beside her cage, then inch toward her dish like a ritual survived and resume her quiet, deliberate bites. She never ate at the same time as Pip. Lila noticed. Still, Pip learned. Slowly, he began to sleep closer to Thistle. Not near, but not across the room, either. Sometimes Lila would find them both facing the same direction, silent witnesses to the soundless sunset. One morning, Thistle pressed her nose to Pip's ear. Just once. A breath. Then pulled back. Lila held hers. The next day, Pip crept forward at feeding time, waited until Lila had settled in, and sat still. Not twitching, just present. Thistle didn't look at him. But she didn't leave either. That evening, while Lila read aloud from the book she'd loved as a girl, Pip curled near Thistle's side and listened. Then came the storm. It rolled in fast, low and sudden. The kind of thunder that cracks at the ribcage. Rain lashed the windows and power flickered in and out like nervous breath. Pip panicked. He darted under the furniture, thumping hard, eyes wide, body trembling like a note out of key. Thistle, accustomed to storms, didn't move. Until Lila whispered gently, "He's scared." And that's when Thistle stood, slowly, deliberately, like a queen descending stairs, and crossed the room. Pip shivered in a corner behind the desk. She thumped once. Then again. Not for fear. For him. Then, she curled beside him. Not touching, but near. He stopped shaking. Lila watched from across the room, tears catching at the corner of her eyes. The next morning, Pip ate when Thistle ate. And Thistle, for the first time, waited for him to start. Inches apart. Two rhythms slowly learning how to meet in the middle. It didn't mean Thistle had changed. She still stared at the same window each night. Still waited for Lila to sit, still refused food unless the eyes that mattered were nearby. But now, when Pip pressed close, she didn't pull away. She flicked an ear, let him stay, and when his nose brushed hers before bed, an awkward, hopeful gesture from a rabbit just beginning to believe in softness, she nudged him back. Not rejection, recognition. Sometimes, after all, even the silent need company. And sometimes, it's not about the rules they build. It's about who learns to wait alongside them. It started with a soft click. The kind of sound you don't notice until you do, until absence carries its own kind of shape. The automatic feeder had been dependable for years. A gift from Lila's uncle, back when she started college, a way to ease the guilt of distance. Same time every morning, same quiet whir. Pip hardly noticed. Food arrived, he jingled his way toward it, nosed into breakfast without ceremony. But Thistle paused. She sniffed once, backed away. Sat. The camera caught it. A small square of light in the corner of the screen. Both rabbits in frame, but only one eating. The other waiting. Not afraid, not upset. Simply, poised. Lila was an hour away, helping a friend move. Her father promised to check in. He did. Walked past the doorway, yawning mid-step, socks sliding against the tile floor. Barely noticed the cage. Barely slowed. But the moment his shadow slipped across the threshold, something shifted. A twitch of the ear. A tilt of the head. Thistle leaned forward, touched her nose to the dish, and began to eat. One bite. Then another. No fanfare. Just enough. Lila watched the clip later, replayed it 3 times. At first, she laughed. But it wasn't funny, really. It was familiar. That quiet kind of waiting that shaped itself into routine. It hadn't gone away, even with Pip. Thistle didn't crave company the same way he did. She wanted something else. She wanted to be known. And from the hallway, her presence had been acknowledged, just barely, but enough. 2 nights later, the feeder jammed again. The video started the same way, Pip eating, Thistle still. Lila's father passed again, this time holding laundry. And again, the tilt, the nibble, the slow beginning that came not from hunger, but permission. When Lila asked him about it, he seemed puzzled. I don't think I did much of anything. Just walked by. Exactly. He frowned, thoughtful. Then said, quietly, she doesn't need someone with her. She needs someone to notice. Lila didn't answer. But she remembered. Her Nana, voice soft as wind, holding apple slices in her hand and saying, some hearts are shaped for sharing time. She hadn't understood it then. But she did now. Because it wasn't proximity that mattered to Thistle. Not truly. It was awareness. To be present, yes, but not as background noise or casual movement. As witness. As someone whose gaze said, I see you. Still here. It explained everything. Why Thistle only ate in front of Lila. Why she stared not at the door, but the window, a place where light lingered just long enough to resemble attention. Why even a shadow in the hallway was enough. She was made for bond, not crowd. Togetherness, not noise. A rabbit designed not to survive on instinct alone, but on the very oldest thing, the quiet comfort of shared time. Not filled with chatter. Not measured in minutes. Just a pulse beside your pulse, a breath that says, I'm with you. That week, Lila wrote it down. A note, left folded beside the feeder, in case of power outages or forgotten steps. It said, don't just feed her. Let her know you're there. The ink smudged when her father set his coffee on it later. But even so, Thistle ate that morning. And in the footage, her ears flicked to the side, toward the camera. Held there, just long enough to remind Lila. She knew she was seen. It began mid-August, with the kind of stillness that doesn't feel like peace, just something holding its breath. Lila noticed first in the way Thistle moved. Or rather, how she didn't. She still came to the food bowl. Still sat in her usual corner for sunset. But the space between each breath seemed longer. Her paws hovered mid-step too often, like she was trying to remember how to move. She didn't thump at the sound of distant thunder that week. She didn't twitch when Pip trampled over her towel. One afternoon, Lila found her collapsed beside her food dish. Not limp, just unmoving, as if sleep had deepened into something too quiet. She scooped her up instinctively, hands gentle but frantic, murmuring words that didn't matter. Pip circled them both, whimpering softly, unsure of where to put himself. At the vet, tests turned to more tests. Blood work, temperature, measurements scribbled onto notepads, but no warnings blinked red. No diagnosis fit. She's just old, the vet said gently, her voice like leaves brushing pavement. Sometimes there's no reason you can name. They offered medicine. Options wrapped in words like palliative and supportive care. Lila nodded, but didn't take any. Instead, she brought Thistle home and laid her in the rocking chair, the one by the bay window with the threadbare cushion her Nana used to sit in. The one that creaked like it remembered things. She wrapped Thistle in a soft towel, laid her head on her lap, turned on the small radio, the one that only got 2 stations, both static-laced and slow. A cello hummed through the quiet. And then they just stayed. Sunlight poured down the walls. Not bright, but gold, soft as butter left in a warm dish. Thistle didn't move, but she wasn't gone. Lila watched her chest rise. Fall. Barely. She didn't call anyone. Didn't check the time. Just moved a single piece of hay from the dish to the edge of the towel. Whispered her name. I'm here. If you want to eat, I'm here. Minutes passed like hours. The slow crawl of time made of breath and intention. Then, movement. Thistle shifted her head slightly. Nudged the hay once. Chewed. One bite. Then another. Deliberate. Unhurried. A kind of communion. Lila touched her gently behind the ears and felt tears prick without falling. Not grief, not yet. Just the vast, tender weight of time. Outside, the wind moved the trees and made no sound. Inside, the rocking chair creaked, back and forth. Later that evening, Lila fell asleep with her hand curled near Thistle's side and the towel warm between them. Pip nestled beneath the chair, keeping vigil in his own small way. No medicine, no formulas, just light, just quiet. Thistle didn't eat the rest of the night. She didn't need to, not after that. She had been witnessed again. Fully, gently, without asking. And sometimes one meal, shared with love, is more than enough. The rain had been endless, 4 days of steady gray, like the sky itself had forgotten how to lift. The windows blurred with condensation. The house felt smaller somehow, as if the damp had crawled into its bones. Thistle hadn't eaten, not a single bite. Even when Lila sat in their usual spot by the window, her voice soft with old stories, a blanket draped between her ankles and the cage, still, the food stayed untouched. Pip paced in edgy circles, thumping once at dusk before curling beside the empty dish. It wasn't panic, not quite, but it was close. That kind of silence you only hear when something is quietly ending. Lila knew. She didn't say it, not even to herself, but the ache had already begun settling into the corners of her body like cold. She walked more softly now. Turned each page of her book like she was afraid the sound might scare something away. On the 5th day, the rain slackened. Not stopped. Just softened, as though even it had grown tired. Lila took the book down from her shelf, a battered paperback with faded corners and a cover creased from years of use. It was the one Nana used to read aloud after tragedies, big and small. The one she'd whispered through after Elsie's return. The one she'd clutched like a lifeline the night after her Nana's funeral. She curled beside the 2 rabbits on the braided rug. No grand gestures, just knees drawn up, socks mismatched. Pip nudged against her ankle. Thistle lay still, her breathing so shallow Lila couldn't tell if it was really there. She opened the book and began to read. The words didn't matter. Not at first. Her voice cracked at the edges, dipped too low on certain syllables, paused too long between sentences. But still, the sound filled the space between them, something familiar, something shared. The story wound onward. A tale about a boy and a key, a garden full of laughter, a hidden room that only opened when someone believed in its door. Lila read each line like a prayer. She didn't look up, not at first. Afraid to look, maybe. Afraid of another still shape that would never move again. But something shifted, just a flicker at the edge of her vision. She turned her head. Thistle, impossibly small in the light, was lifting her body. Barely, as if the motion itself cost something. Her head tilted toward Lila. Her eyes didn't blink, only held the gaze. Lila held her breath. And then, a bite. Tiny. Practically invisible. A slow turn of the head, and then another. Her teeth grazed the edge of the hay, barely more than a whisper of motion. But it was a bite. Just one. It was enough. Lila didn't say anything. Her throat had closed around the weight of the moment. All she could do was keep reading, voice unsteady, eyes burning. After a minute, Thistle eased her head down beside Lila's arm. Her breathing stilled, not frightened, not in pain, just stilled. Pip tucked himself tighter into Lila's side. She didn't even notice the tears until she felt one land on her hand, startlingly warm against her cold skin. Outside, the clouds broke open. Not with rain, but with light. Sun spilled through the window like water. Pale, filtered gold kissed the edges of the bookshelves, the carpet, the tips of Thistle's ears. The light reached her last. Illuminated the soft curve of her side. She looked like something belonging to the moment, not just the room. Almost glowing. Lila didn't move. She read until her voice ran out, then rested her forehead gently against the floorboards beside Thistle's shape. No heartbeat answered, but the room did not feel empty. Not exactly. Instead, it felt full, with silence, with memory, with the kind of presence that stays even when breath has stopped. When her father found her later, he didn't speak. Just knelt beside her and laid a careful hand on her shoulder. They sat there together, in the hush of light and dust, while the house breathed around them like it still remembered how. And in that moment, it did. The house was quieter after. Not the kind of silence that feels peaceful, but the kind that lingers in places where footsteps used to go. In the corner where the cage had been, the carpet bore a faint indent, like memory pressed into fabric. Lila hadn't moved it right away. She thought she would, but instead, she just stopped looking too closely. As if looking made it too real. Pip noticed first. He would dart toward the corner and stop short, as if expecting Thistle's shape to rise from the shadows and greet him. But there was only the dust caught in the window light, swirling silently in her absence. He didn't eat much that week. Lila understood. The routines they all knew had been broken at the root. There was no gentle presence at dusk. No ears twitching toward the sound of a page turning. The room felt off balance, as though something necessary had slipped just beneath the floorboards. Still, she tried. She sat with Pip the same way she used to sit with Thistle, knees tucked underneath her, palms soft on the rug. She whispered the rabbit's name, as if some piece of her might echo back in fur or breath or movement. But it wasn't Thistle who responded. It was Pip. He twitched, still and unsure, then crept over toward the dish, eyes locked not on the food, but on her. And when he began to eat, Lila cried. Not like a storm, but like rain through leaves. Quiet, almost grateful. He had learned, not just from her, but from Thistle. The gaze mattered, the pause, the knowing someone was near. She whispered, "I'm here," as his nose found the pellets. And he flicked one ear, nodding in his own small way. After that, they made new rituals. Not to replace the old, but to carry them forward. Lila no longer hesitated before opening the bedroom door. The chair still rocked sometimes when no one sat in it. And once, she caught herself looking toward the corner at sunset before realizing why her breath had caught. The house was still quiet. But it no longer felt empty. It began with a flicker of something out of place. Lila had left the room as she always did, turned off the lamp by the cage, folded the blanket without thinking. Pip had been quiet lately but not withdrawn, content to curl in the warm patches of lingering sunlight, still waiting for the small rituals that once belonged to two. She walked back in the next morning, barefoot against the cool floor, and stopped. There, stretching from the edge of the rocking chair to the old windowsill, lay a trail of food pellets. Single file, not scattered, not accidental. Arranged with purpose. Tiny markers laid out like someone had been walking themselves backward into memory. She stared at it for a long time before moving. The rocking chair creaked slightly, as if still remembering the shape of a curled paw. And on the windowsill, something new, a torn scrap of paper. Not large, but unmistakable. The dried edge of a page from her childhood book. The one Thistle had always listened to. The page where the garden door first opened. Lila walked to it slowly. Picked it up like it might turn to ash if her hand trembled. A single nibble mark dented the bottom corner. The kind rabbits make when they forget not to chew what they love. She didn't say anything, just sat down beside Pip, holding the piece of torn paper in her palm, looking not at him, but beside him. Past him, into the small space where something invisible had shifted. It wasn't magic, she murmured. Right? Pip turned his head toward her, then back to the window. They both looked there, together. Was it Thistle? No, not exactly. But something had remained. A presence passed down, not vanished. Pip had learned the weight of company. The meaning of pausing before a meal. The shape of waiting for acknowledgement before choosing to stay. Actions repeat. Habits echo. She looked again at the trail of pellets. Careful spacing. Steady rhythm. Leading from one memory to another. They weren't breadcrumbs. They were footprints, left in reverse. Thistle didn't haunt the space. She had taught it how to listen. Grief doesn't vanish, it changes shape. Sometimes into silence. Sometimes into small signs. Sometimes into another creature curling beside your ankle in quiet imitation. Lila smiled then, though it trembled. She reached for Pip, who leaned into her touch. Good job, she whispered. Not to the rabbit. Not even to herself. Just to the space between. For what had been held. For what still remained. Nothing eternal. But not gone, either. Some things linger like dust on the windowsill. Some things live in the way doors are left cracked open. And some rabbits teach others how to leave letters in dust. It was years later, on a pale January morning, when Lila stepped through the back door of the rescue shelter and into that long, familiar hush of fur and quiet breathing. She had started volunteering again. Not out of obligation, but because something kept pulling her back, toward small hearts, toward still eyes, toward the places where silence didn't mean emptiness. The shelter hadn't changed in the ways she thought it would. It still smelled faintly of hay and old blankets. The same clock ticked too loudly on the wall near the office. And the pens were still scattered with names written in laminated stars. She moved carefully, her boots squeaking on tile, offering the kind of slow glance that meant patience and nothing more. No sudden movements, no rushed affection. Then she saw her. In the far corner near the heater, a white rabbit. Not quite the color of snow. Not quite cloud. Something between. Her fur was patchy in places, as if time had pulled bits of it loose. One ear tilted slightly sideways. Her spine seemed too long for comfort. But it was the eyes that stopped Lila. Dark. Still. Unblinking in that way that felt nothing like fear. Not dull, not lost, just waiting. Lila leaned against the gate, breath soft. The rabbit didn't move, didn't shift or skitter the way the others had when strangers passed. No shuffle, no twitch. Just a look. Direct. Level. There was a bowl of food beside her. Untouched. Lila stayed. For 20 minutes. No words. No noise. Just a few quiet inches of air between them. And then, without warning, the rabbit moved. One paw. Then another. She leaned forward, nose brushing a few strands of hay. Then a slow mouthful. Not greedy. Not hesitant. Lila didn't breathe. When she finally rose to stand, a worker poked her head in. Did she eat? Lila blinked. Yes. That one hasn't touched anything since she got here. We were beginning to worry. Lila shook her head a little, not to dismiss, but to soften the noise. She was still listening. Was it Thistle? No. But something lived in that space. A rhythm passed forward. A knowing. Not identical, but familiar. Maybe this rabbit had known someone once. Maybe she'd lost them. Or maybe she'd just been born into a world that didn't know how to sit still long enough to be soft. That evening, Lila sat again on the floor, this time with her legs stretched gently toward the nearest pen. The rabbit shuffled close, not touching, but nearer. You don't have to be her, Lila murmured. But I think maybe she taught me how to be with you. The rabbit flicked one ear, then lowered her head. And again, ate. Not because of hunger. but because this time someone was watching who meant it. If you've ever wondered whether animals feel our presence, really feel it, think of a rabbit who paused before every meal. Not for instinct, not for fear, but for eyes. Thistle waited, always, for someone to see her. Not just to glance, but to notice. To witness. And only then would she lean forward, quiet as breath, and begin. She never asked for noise. She never needed touch. Just time, shared. A gaze that lingered long enough to mean something. And through that, through ritual and stillness, through silence and soft movement, she taught people how to stay. How to sit without hurry. How to notice quiet things as sacred. She was not magic. She was not a symbol. She was simply a small life, lived with deep attention. But from that smallness, she changed everything. She comforted a grieving girl too young to name the ache in her bones. She kept vigil in doorways and turned her ears toward unseen things. She waited beside food not because she couldn't eat, but because kindness shared tasted different. And when the world hurt, when a friend went missing, when goodbyes stacked like folded paper, she did not run or hide. She waited, because presence was her language. And in return, she taught Lila and Pip, and a house that once felt too quiet, how to listen. How to stay near without fixing. How to carry love through the soft choreography of routine. Even after. Even now. Because sometimes the ones who change us don't take up much space. They just fill the right corner of a day, the pause in a sentence, the edge of sunlight on a rug. And in doing so, they leave something behind. Not a ghost, but warmth in old chairs. A habit passed through fur and breath. A trail of small choices that let us be gentle again. So when you see a rabbit, or any creature, who hesitates before a meal, who waits for the sound of closeness before they begin, maybe they're not waiting for food. Maybe, like Thistle, they're waiting to be seen. To be reminded that the smallest moments, a glance, a hush, a whisper of, "I'm here," can mean the world. Some hearts are built to share time. And when we notice them, when we sit down among their rules and offer quiet instead of noise, we get to learn their language. And in learning it, we remember our own. There's something about memory that lingers in objects. Not the loud things, photographs, keepsakes, boxes with tape peeling at the edges. But the quiet ones, the mug that never left the shelf. The blanket that still carries the curve of her. The floorboard that creaks even when you aren't standing on it. Lila didn't plan to keep the cage. Honestly, she thought it might hurt too much. Empty space with too much shape. But she didn't disassemble it. Not yet. She cleaned it gently one last time. Pressed her fingertips to the metal frame like closing a book. Folded the towel Thistle used to sleep on and tucked it inside a box lined with cedar chips. Smoothed it down twice. Then she left the door open. A crack. A breath. Pip sometimes wandered by and sat in front of it, as if still expecting her figure to stretch softly from the shadows. He never went inside, only watched. Ears angled forward, body quiet like it had learned something about respect. Lila whispered once, without even meaning to, "She's teaching us both, still." Sometimes, she caught herself doing the old things, sitting too still in silence, pausing before placing food in Pip's bowl, glancing toward the window just before the sun bent westward across the glass. Not checking, just remembering. You never know what rituals will outlive the reason they began. One day, she came home from her job at the library, shoulders heavy with weather and words, and opened the door to find Pip not where she left him. She almost called out, a low spark of panic, until she looked toward the corner by the rocking chair and saw him. Still, staring through the fading light at something she couldn't see. And beside him, arranged in a neat arc across the floor, were 3 small pieces of apple. Lila's breath caught. He had never picked up fruit like that before. Never gathered, never placed. The pieces looked deliberate. Blessings, echoes, or simply memory finding a new way to speak. No magic, no music swelling, just the creak of the floor as she knelt beside him and whispered, "You remember her, don't you?" Pip didn't move, but he didn't need to. She reached for one of the apple slices. Bit into it, tart, sweet, quiet between her teeth. He stood straighter, and only then did he begin to eat. She didn't cry, not like before. This time, it felt like something blooming quietly after frost. Not erasing the cold, just proving it didn't end everything. Some hearts echo forward, not in voices, in behavior, in patience, in the way love is passed hand to paw to breath. Lila didn't touch the apples. Not all of them. She left one by the door. Not for ghosts. Not even for her. Just in case some small, quiet thing was learning to wait. It happened quietly, like most things that matter. Spring had leaned itself back into the world, soft rains polishing the windows, small buds pressing out from trees with a kind of bravery that didn't ask to be noticed. Lila had stopped expecting signs. That wasn't grief's shape anymore. Grief had become something else. A thread woven into her days. A smile that paused at old corners. Pip had grown older too. Not old, but steadier. He no longer tripped over his feet. No longer panicked at thunder. He sat, often, in the same spot Thistle once preferred. Facing the light, not for her, just because it had become the kind of place where comfort gathered. One evening, as the sun folded itself across the rug, Lila sat beside the cage she never quite put away. It was still clean, still open. The towel inside smelled of cedar and remembered hands. She had stopped thinking of it as waiting for someone. It had simply become a place. Pip was at her feet. He didn't move, didn't twitch. But as the light dimmed, he looked toward the window, not with expectation, but with memory. And that was enough. Lila pulled an old notebook from the shelf, not the one with Nana's recipes or the one with poems from school. Just a blank one, bound in blue. She opened it, stared at the page for a long time. Then began to write, not about Thistle, not directly, but about the pause between things. The time it takes for a silence to feel full instead of empty. About apples cut too early. About blankets that still hold shape after the weight is gone. She didn't mean to start a book. Only a sentence. But the sentence grew. Beneath the desk, Pip shifted. Climbed into her lap with a deliberate thump of weight. Lila smiled. Outside, the wind moved the branches. The light deepened. And the house, the whole house, felt as though it had leaned closer. She remembered something her Nana had said once, long ago, when Lila thought she'd forgotten how to answer grief. If it still makes you gentle, it's still with you. Lila paused her writing, looked at Pip, and whispered, "She'd like that you remembered." He didn't reply, but his nose brushed her wrist. And in that small motion lived more memory than words ever could. There was an old drawer in the hallway that stuck whenever it rained. No one used it anymore, except when keys got lost or memories refused to stay shelved. Lila opened it on a whim one morning, chasing neither. Just following that odd breath of instinct that sometimes lingers between breakfast and nothing important. Inside, a bundle of papers. Notes from school, a folded vet receipt, an origami star she couldn't remember folding. And tucked in the back, a photograph. Not of Thistle. Thistle had never let them take pictures. Anytime someone raised a camera, she'd shift with uncanny timing, like she knew when a moment wasn't meant for framing. No, this photo was of Lila, much younger, sitting cross-legged with a book open in her lap. In the corner of the image, just barely in frame, was a faint blur. Almost nothing. But Lila remembered the exact cardigan she was wearing, the lamp on the floor beside her, and the way the room had felt when Thistle leaned just close enough for her ear to brush Lila's sock. That memory was clearer than the photograph. She ran her finger along the edge of the blur. Closed her eyes. A breath, that's all. Sometimes she dreamed of that feeling, a presence that asked nothing, only reminded her she wasn't alone in the listening. Later that week, she visited the shelter again. Not for another rabbit, not yet, but because the quiet there matched her own. The same girl greeted her at the door, the one with the striped hair and the stack of names always tumbling from her clipboard. "Someone left this," she said, handing Lila a small cloth bag tied with twine. "Didn't leave a name, just said it belonged to someone who remembered stillness." Inside was a small bundle of dried herbs, a sheet of handmade paper, and one gray-white feather. Lila didn't ask. Some gestures are their own language. That night, she placed the feather beside Thistle's old dish. Not as tribute, not as shrine, just because it looked right there. Pip moved slowly toward it, touched it with his nose, sat beside it. Lila watched from the doorway. Waited. When Pip began to eat, she smiled, wide, then soft. Then turned. Left them to it. The house didn't feel haunted. It felt kept. Watched over. Not by the past, but by the shape of care that never forgot how to curl into corners. She didn't carry Thistle anymore. She walked beside her. Quietly. Always. It started with absence. Not the heavy kind, not grief, but the slow, quiet thinning of something once constant. Pip no longer waited at the door. He sat by the dish patiently, but less often looked toward the hallway before eating. Lila noticed. She said nothing. It wasn't forgetting. It was becoming. He didn't need to mimic anymore. He lived the rhythm now. Each evening, she still sat beside him. Not because of ritual, but because she liked to. Sometimes she read, sometimes not. The silence had changed. It no longer held sorrow. Now it invited her. One morning, she left the apple slice a little farther from his usual place, closer to the windowsill. Just something small, to see. Pip found it without hesitation. Ate it there, in the sun's first light. Ears relaxed, breath calm. He didn't look for her first. Didn't check if someone watched. But Lila did. Quietly. From the hall. She smiled. Later that week, she caught herself humming. A tune she didn't recognize. Or maybe it had been years. One of those soft, nowhere melodies people hum when their hands remember something their minds don't. She was feeding Pip when it happened. He paused. Turned. Ears high. And then resumed eating, slower this time. Matching her rhythm. As if her song had filled the space they'd once needed to watch. That afternoon, she wrote 2 letters. One she mailed. One she folded into the small wooden box where she kept Thistle's towel and old brush, tucked beside bits of lavender and a broken button from her Nana's blouse. No reason. Just felt right. As spring deepened, birds nested higher in the trees. The garden bloomed awkwardly, too early in some spots, hesitant in others. Pip wandered more now, slept under different chairs. He had grown into the house's memory without needing to echo it. The cage gathered dust. Still open. Always open. Lila placed a new towel inside it, fresh and soft. No plan, no new animal. Just invitation. Sometimes she'd pass by and pause. Not expecting anything, just to feel it beside her. One dusk, as the light turned amber, she lit the old lamp again. The one with the humming bulb. Sat beside it, book balanced on one knee. Pip nestled into the crook of her legs. He sighed, yes, rabbit's sigh, and rested his head down. She opened the book, began reading. Her voice rolled gently, like a tide that had learned how to come and go without crashing. She didn't cry, didn't ache, But she turned one page, then another. And felt, somewhere deep in the quiet between the words, a weight beside her. Not physical, but known, like the house itself exhaled. She closed the book halfway through a chapter. Ran her hand down Pip's back, slow and even. "Thank you," Lila whispered to the room. No one stirred, but the lamp flickered once, then stilled. And all around her, there was no missing. Only presence. It had been years since the house held a hush that thickened around 7 p.m., the kind of hush that waits. The cage had long been packed away, the towel stored, the apple slices no longer a habit. Pip had passed gently, in the corner Thistle once loved, one paw outstretched toward nothing. Lila had been there. Of course she had. She'd woken without knowing why, crossed the creaking floor barefoot, and found him already quiet. No fear, no resistance, just rest. The silence afterward didn't ache the same way. It didn't scrape. It draped. The kind that comes from something having run its full course. Grief returned only as a softness now. A reverence for small things. Lila let herself live differently. She took long walks past dusk, planted vegetables even though the soil didn't always listen, read aloud from old books to empty rooms and didn't mind the way no one answered. Her days no longer orbited a bowl or a breath. But they carried the memory of it. Every action slower, every goodbye more complete. One spring morning, she stood at the kitchen window. Light fell through it the same way it always had, pooling on the wooden counter like an old friend laying down their coat. She held her tea in both hands, just for the weight. And somewhere between the steam and the silence, she remembered something her Nana used to say, "Time isn't meant to be filled. It's meant to be felt." Lila sat down, and waited, for nothing specific, not for a rustle or a whisper or a rabbit's ear brushing against shadow. She didn't expect signs anymore. But her stillness was ready, just in case. She'd learned that from 3 creatures with quiet paws and stubborn hearts. One who had to be seen. One who had to learn how. And one who came after and made space for both. They had given her a language that didn't require words. So even now, without a cage, without fur, she found herself speaking it. In the way she paused before setting her own meal down. In the way she tilted her face toward the window when the sun began to lower. In the way she touched door handles gently, never slamming them, always keeping them open by a hair. Outside, something chirped. Inside, nothing moved. Still, she whispered, "I see you." Not to spirits. Not to ghosts. To time. To memory. To the outline left behind by presence so honest it kept shaping her long after it was gone. She smiled, finished her tea, and left the cup beside the lamp with the singing bulb. It hummed once, and somewhere unseen, but not unfelt, something settled again.